Welcome back to this lecture series for ethics. In this video we will complete our discussion of the ethics of Immanuel Kant. And to do so, I want to look at an application of what we called last time Kant's principle of humanity. So you'll recall the principle of humanity has a couple of components. What it's supposed to express is what it means to show respect for the fundamental importance and status of human beings. So Kant tells us first, it's never acceptable to treat another person as a mere means to an end. We can't undermine their autonomy or choice in order to get what we want or even produce a good outcome for others. Instead of treating other people as a mere means to an end, we must always treat them as ends in themselves. We must treat them as the sort of beings that have a fundamental importance in and of themselves, which makes them replaceable, and treat them with a status that respects the dignity that they have. Instead of treating human beings as if they have a price or can be exchanged or used for some greater purpose, we must recognize their dignity and treat them with the sort of respect that you would treat something that's priceless, something that, as Kant says, is elevated above all price. And Kant thinks these two components, treating a being as an end in itself and never treating a human being merely as a means, we don't only just apply to other people, we also apply them to ourselves. And this forms the foundation of what we might call self-respect. Now in this video, I want to further consider this principle of humanity by applying it to the topic of criminal punishment. And to do that, we're going to focus on some comments that Kant makes in an essay entitled The Right of Punishing. Now, before we get into Kant's comments themselves, we should make a few preliminary points about criminal punishment itself and sort of the philosophical terrain that surrounds this issue. The issue we are concerned with here is what justifies criminal punishment, right? So our concern right now isn't necessarily what is the best kind of punishment or what sort of punishments are appropriate for certain crimes, although we'll get into that later to a certain extent. Our question right now is, why is society permitted to punish people who act in incorrect and harmful ways? And there are many different theories of punishment, many different answers to this question, but in broad strokes, there are usually two basic approaches to this question. On the one hand, there is a consequentialist approach. And the consequentialist approach will say, well, the reason we are justified in punishing criminals and punishing wrongdoers is because it produces a beneficial outcome or consequence for society. So utilitarian like John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham, individuals like that would of course take this view. They would say, well, the reason we punish someone has to do with the beneficial outcome. Because punishment in itself, whether we're talking about a fine for a parking ticket or putting someone in prison or even something like the death penalty, punishment just considered in itself is always bad because it is harmful. It produces pain. So in order for that to be justified, it must produce some compensating benefits for society. And what the consequentialists say is it's that benefit which explains why we are justified in punishing criminals. So ultimately, if punishment of criminals makes society happier, safer, and more prosperous, then we're justified in doing it. And if it doesn't do those things, then we're not justified in doing it. That's the consequentialist view. On the other hand, there's the retributivist theory of punishment. And the retributivist theory of punishment, which is the one Kant holds, says that what justifies an act of punishment is only the past behavior of the person being punished. The reason someone is given a fine through a parking ticket or put in prison or even put to death has nothing to do with the beneficial consequences to society. There will be some beneficial consequences, and that's fine, and we'll look at what these are in a second, but that's not the reason you're being punished. The reason you are being punished for those things is to exact justice, is to exact retribution for the wrongdoing you have done. The reason you're being punished is because you deserve to have something bad happen to you as a result of the actions you have taken. So another way to think about this difference is that the consequentialist theory is forward-looking. What matters is what the future consequence will be. What will happen in the future as a result of this punishment? The retributivist theory, which is the one Kant takes, is backward looking. What really matters is what did you do in the past, and does your past behavior now warrant or make you deserve having something undesirable or bad happen to you now? So these are the two major answers to this question. And before we look at Kant's retributivism, I want to say a few other things about the consequentialist approach, which may motivate why Kant would take the opposite approach. So we said that for the consequentialist theory, there has to be some benefit to society to justify punishing people for the wrongdoing that they do. And there could be many such benefits, but usually the major three benefits identified as a result of punishment are the following. So first, deterrence. One reason we would punish people is because if you know there's a punishment for a certain action, it's going to make people less likely to do it. Now, of course, people are always still going to break the law, but the idea is that, if murder or robbery wasn't illegal, many more people would do it. If there wasn't a punishment attached to it, many more people would do it. But because there is a punishment attached, that gives a disincentive and makes people not want to do the action. Another reason for criminal punishment is security. Many people who engage in criminal behavior, specifically violent criminal behavior, may be dangerous individuals who we don't want in greater society because of the harm they might cause. So by removing these individuals from society, the idea is hopefully make society safer and more secure. And then finally, rehabilitation. If we say that, well, if there's some reason this person is acting improperly, they're being harmful and dangerous to other members of the community, perhaps there is something about their personality or their character or the way they're living their life that needs to be fixed and rehabilitated. And so if you see the criminal justice system as also a way of enacting that rehabilitation, of allowing people to reform their characters, then this would produce a great benefit for society as well. The individual in question would be able to turn their life around, and once they're released back into society, if they truly have reformed themselves, then society now has another functioning, productive member of society, which would contribute to the overall happiness and well-being. So the point is just that consequentialists identify reasons like this as the fundamental reason why we punish people. We're punishing you because it will deter crime. We're punishing you because it will make society safer and more secure. Now, many people take this view, but just as a way of motivating why Kant thinks this view is wrong, as a way of motivating why actually Kant thinks not only is this view wrong, but it's fundamentally disrespectful to criminals. And this might be the sort of surprising point, right? Kant as we're going to see, thinks criminal punishment is essential, and he even supports the death penalty. He supports very severe punishments for very severe crimes. And the reason he supports that is not because he thinks we need severe punishments to stop people from doing crime. No, he says we need severe punishments for severe crimes because giving them a punishment that's anything less than severe would be to disrespect them. And to punish people on the basis of doing so will produce good consequences for society, he thinks treats criminals as a mere means to an end, which, as we saw, is the basis of showing disrespect. Now, to see why this might be the case, I want you to recall an example I talked about previously in my lectures on utilitarianism. We imagine the situation where perhaps you could prevent a lot of harm and suffering and pain by punishing someone who's innocent. Maybe until a culprit is found for a given crime in the town, people are going to be rioting and causing all kinds of chaos and destruction. And so just to make that stop, you say, well, look, why don't I just pick up the first unpopular innocent person in town, say they did it, and punish them? If punishment really just is about producing good consequences, and punishing an innocent person would produce good consequences, then how can we say it's wrong? Or think of another example. Let's say that in this case you say, look, the people in this town are getting a little unruly, they're breaking the law too much, but we haven't been able to actually catch any of the real culprits. But in order to stop this sort of crime spree, we're just going to pick up the first innocent person we see, and we're going to give them a severe punishment in the town square with everyone watching. And you say, look, I know this person didn't do anything wrong, but we need to deter crime. We need to scare people out of committing crimes. Now, when you reflect on ideas like that, when you reflect on the fact that all these beneficial consequences of punishment could hypothetically also come from punishing innocent people, you might say, well, maybe there's something wrong with the consequentialist view. Maybe punishment isn't all about producing good consequences. Maybe it's a good thing that we can make society safer, more secure, and prevent crime through punishment. That's fine. But maybe the fundamental reason for punishment isn't those consequences. If you think that the guilty and only the guilty should be punished, then you might be more attracted to a view which says, well, the reason we punish someone is because they deserve to be punished. And if you have that intuition, and if you're fundamentally troubled and think it's extremely wrong-headed, the idea that a good consequence could come from punishing an innocent person, then you might be more attracted to Kant's retributive view of criminal punishment. So now that we've examined the nature of the consequentialist theory of punishment, let's turn to Kant's theory of punishment, the retributivist view. And I think the following two passages from The Right of Punishing really do a good job of distilling what the retributivist theory of Kant, what that theory entails. So the first of these passages says the following. Kant tells us that the penal law is a categorical imperative, and woe to him who creeps through the serpent windings of utilitarianism to discover some advantage that may discharge him from the justice of punishment. So in the previous examples where we were talking about why someone might reject the consequentialist view, we talked about punishments that were overly harsh because they were punishments leveled against someone who was innocent. But here we see that Kant is also in favor of the retributivist view, where you punish someone merely because they have done something wrong. One of his other motivations is that he wants to avoid allowing people to get off scot-free without being punished. Because let's say you say, okay, someone's done something wrong and they really deserve or warrant being punished for this thing, but I don't really see any good that's going to come from it. Right? I don't see any good beneficial consequence that would be produced for this person or for society. And so you might start to say to yourself, well, what is the point of punishing at all? And this is what Kant means here when he says, look, the law is a categorical imperative. The law which says that wrongdoers should be punished is a categorical imperative which we have an absolute duty to follow. And this is why he says, woe to him who creeps through the serpent windings of utilitarianism. I love that phrase. Right? The idea that you're trying to look at what you think the future consequences of the punishment will be and maybe find a way to wiggle out of exacting a punishment on this wrongdoer. That's exactly the attitude that Kant thinks we should not take toward punishment. But you might ask why? Why is it so important that all the guilty and only the guilty are punished? Why is it so important that every wrongdoer receives justice for the crimes that he or she has committed? Well, Kant explains this in the following way. He says, if justice and righteousness perish, human life would no longer have any value in the world. Now, this may seem weird. You might say, well, why is it that the value of human life, the value of human beings and rational beings, hinges on whether we properly punish every last wrongdoer? Why would it be, if we have this status and dignity, then why does our inherent value depend on whether we adopt a retributivist view of punishment where all wrongdoers must be punished? Well, to see why this is the case, you have to think about a little bit, why does Kant think we have dignity? Well, I've told you it's because we have reason and we have free will and choice, and that's all true. But why does reason matter? Well, remember, for Kant, it is only because there are beings with reason that exist that morality is possible in the first place. Merely instinctual beings like animals can't understand the moral law. They can't act from duty. They can't understand the categorical imperative. It is only beings with reason, like human beings, that can understand the moral law, that can understand the categorical imperative, that can do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. So the whole reason we have dignity, the whole reason we have a special status, is because without us, there would be no morality. If all rational beings were instantly wiped out of the universe, and all that was left was instinctual animals and inanimate objects and plants, there would be no more right and wrong. That's where our status comes from. But that means if we stopped exacting justice, if we stop putting moral values into place, if we don't punish those who have done something wrong, then what is the point of having rational beings in the first place? If we allow our sympathy and our compassion and our instincts to sort of undermine what we know to be just and fair and deserved, then the value that human life had in the first place of upholding morality no longer holds. This is why punishment is so important for Kant, in part anyway. It's because it's an expression of our rational nature. And you can further see that Kant takes punishment very seriously in the following famous passage where he explains specifically the importance of the death penalty. So here's what Kant says. Even if a civil society resolved to dissolve itself with the consent of all its members, as might be supposed in the case of a people inhabiting an island resolving to separate and scatter themselves throughout the whole world. So he's imagining you've got this civilization on some island and they've been going along fine, but then they decide for whatever reason they're going to break apart the society and all go their separate ways. So, they're packing everything up, they're making their travel arrangements, but Kant says, wait, there's one last thing that needs to be done before you go. Kant says, the last murderer lying in the prison ought to be executed before the resolution was carried out. This ought to be done in order that everyone may realize the desert of his deeds and that blood guiltiness may not remain upon the people. There's a lot packed in those few sentences. First, we see that, again, this highlights the extent to which Kant does not think punishment is about consequences. The reason they need to execute the last murderer in prison is not to benefit society, because at the end of the day, society is not going to exist soon. They're all disbanding. So what is the purpose of executing the last murderer in prison? Again, he says, we do this so that everyone may realize the desert of his deeds. It's important that we exact the moral law. It's important that we exact the categorical imperative, and that we punish people on that basis so that people realizes that wrongdoing has consequences and people realize what they have done and take responsibility for it. But if we simply let people off the hook, then there's a wrongdoing for which justice has not been exacted. The scales of justice are uneven. And so for Kant, this is why punishment is so important. It's not about the consequences for society. It's simply about exacting retribution for wrongs that have been done, and it's our ability to do this which undergirds the special status and importance that ultimately human beings have. Now, Kant's purpose in the essay, The Right of Punishing, is not just to defend his retributivist view of punishment, it's also to defend the justness of the death penalty. And it's worth us breaking down his reasoning for this claim because I think it also highlights again the importance of the principle of humanity. So here is my understanding of the argument, which I'll call Kant's retributivist argument for the death penalty. First premise. Some criminal punishment is justified if and only if the punishment serves as retribution for the criminal's behavior. So the first premise just affirms the retributivist view and rejects the consequentialist view. We punish people merely because they have done something wrong. And we can see Kant affirming this in a few more important passages. So he says juridical punishment can never be administered merely as a means for promoting another good. That phrase, of course, is crucial, merely as a means, either with regard to the criminal himself or to society, but must in all cases be imposed only because the individual on whom it is inflicted has committed a crime. So think about this. Let's say you don't like the retributivist view, you support the consequentialist view. You say, look, I'm going to punish this criminal because it will make society safer. Well, wait a minute, isn't that criminal a person? Isn't that criminal a rational being? Didn't Kant's principle of humanity say we are never allowed to use rational beings as a mere means to an end? And isn't that in fact what you're doing? If you're saying the reason I am punishing you is because punishing you will make society safer, aren't you using that person as a means to the end of the safety of society? And if we're never allowed to use a person as a mere means to an end, then how could that be justified? In Kant's view, the consequentialist view of punishment shows an utter disrespect for the personhood of criminals. Now, of course, as we've seen, this doesn't mean that Kant thinks people should get off lightly, and quite the opposite. But he says it matters the reason you're punishing. The reason you're punishing should merely be because this person broke the moral law, this person acted incorrectly. And a further comment he makes here is also important. He says, look, if the reason we were punishing was for consequentialist reasons of making society safer, punishment would be illegitimate. So Kant tells us, against such treatment, his inborn personality has a right to protect him. He must first be found guilty and then punishable. And think about that statement. Against such treatment, his inborn personality has a right to protect him. So he's saying, look, if all punishment is just using people as a mere means to an end, using people as a mere means to the end of the safety of society, then that's illegitimate treatment, because that's showing fundamental disrespect to persons. It violates the principle of humanity. But if punishment violates the principle of humanity, then it's not actually legitimate. That means if you've committed a crime and that punishment that they want to exact is illegitimate, when the state comes to arrest you or put you in prison or even take your life, at that point they are violating your fundamental rights. And if what they're doing is illegitimate, you have a right to defend yourself. Because people don't have the right to attack you and force you to do things and use you as a mere means to an end. So again, Kant isn't saying that punishment actually is illegitimate, but he's saying the legitimacy it has doesn't come from the consequences it produces. It comes from the fact that it is exacting justice in a retributive manner. And if it didn't, the whole system would fall apart and it would be an imposition on our rights. So the first premise of the argument tells us that punishment is only justified if it serves as retribution. The second premise tells us what it means for punishment to serve as retribution. So the second premise, in my understanding, would read, some punishment can serve as retribution for the criminal's behavior if and only if that punishment treats the criminal in a way that is sufficiently serious to match the severity of the criminal's wrongdoing. The idea is that we can only exact retribution for your crime if whatever punishment we give you matches the severity of what you have done. And Kant explains this point in a couple of passages. He says, it may be rendered by saying that the undeserved evil which anyone commits on another is to be regarded as perpetuated on himself. Hence it may be said, if you slander another, you slander yourself. If you steal from another, you steal from yourself. If you strike another, you strike yourself. If you kill another, you kill yourself. And so, well, why is he saying this? Why should we conceive of the idea that whenever someone commits a crime or an evil act, they should think of themselves not just doing that on someone else, but doing it to themselves? Well, I think it fundamentally has to do with Kant's conception of the moral law. According to Kant's conception, when we act, our actions are not only personal maxims for action. When we act, because we are rational beings, we are implicitly saying it's okay for anybody to act in this way. That it's fine if I steal from someone, I'm implicitly saying that I think it's fine for everyone to steal. If I kill someone else, I'm implicitly saying it's fine for anyone to kill. If I lie, the same thing. So that means whenever you commit a crime against another person, you're implicitly saying it's okay for them to do that to you. And then what that means is you are implicitly giving permission or consenting or thinking it's a good idea that the state can then punish you in a sufficiently severe way as you punish someone else. That's the fundamental idea here. So he continues on, if you steal from another, you steal for yourself. In this way, that whoever steals anything makes the property of all insecure, he therefore robs himself of all security and property according to the right of retaliation. Now, of course, it's one thing to say that the state can punish you with equal severity, but why should they? Right? Fundamentally, why should the state be concerned with doing this? Why is it a good idea for them to do it, not just that they can? And I think here, again, we have to think about the principle of humanity and the idea of showing respect for persons. So, first of all, consider who are some beings, some individuals, for whom you might punish in a certain sense, but you don't punish with the full severity of their crime. And of course, the obvious example here is children. When children engage in wrongdoing, we don't ask ourselves the question, okay, well, let me tally up and sort of think about what is the harm that they have done, and let me do the exact same harm back onto them. In fact, for children who are quite young, you start with timeouts that are of very narrow time constraints. For very young children, just a minute timeout can actually be an almost excruciating experience. And we don't say, oh my gosh, we let them off the hook, right? We didn't, whatever wrongdoing it is that they did, maybe they actually harmed someone in a significant way. Maybe they kicked them in the shins. Engage in all sorts of other shenanigans that children are wont to do. But when they do that, we don't say, well, we have to kick them in the chins. No, we would consider that child abuse. We give them a timeout, and we recognize that this punishment is not nearly as severe as what they may have done to somebody else. But that's not unjust, and that's because children aren't adults. Children aren't full moral and legal persons, we might say. But now let's say we're dealing with an adult, and let's say this adult is a murderer. They killed someone else, but we say, you know what? We're going to take mercy on you. We're going to take mercy on you, and we're not going to punish you with the death penalty. We're going to give you some punishment that's less severe than that. Well, wait a minute. How is that fair? How is that just? How does that show respect for that person? Are we treating this fully grown adult with reason and a will as if they are a mere child? Are we treating a rational being as if they were a being that merely ran on instinct? And of course, that is the foundation of disrespect. You're failing to recognize the status this person has as a rational being. So Kant isn't just saying, look, whatever you do to someone else needs to happen to you out of some sense of basic fairness. He's saying if you don't punish someone in a way that's sufficiently severe to match what they did, you are showing disrespect to that person. And if you're showing disrespect to that person, then ultimately you are violating the principle of humanity. So if we put the first two premises of the argument together, we get the first conclusion. Some criminal punishment is justified if and only if that punishment treats the criminal in a way that is sufficiently serious to match the severity of what they did wrong. So legitimate punishments always match the crime. That's the basic idea. And then we get the third premise of the argument, now relating this to the death penalty. The death penalty is the only punishment that is sufficiently serious to match the severity of the crime of murder. And we see Kant express this idea most clearly in the following passage. But whoever has committed murder must die. There is in this case no juridical substitute or surrogate that can be given or taken for the satisfaction of justice. So he's saying, look, if you committed murder, then you are implicitly saying that you accept that murder is an acceptable way to act. You're legislating it as the moral law, per se. Which means you should be comfortable with it happening to you. You make your bed, now you have to sleep in it. And of course, as I've outlined the premises say that whatever punishment you get has to be sufficiently serious to match the severity of what you've done. So you might say, well, yeah, I agree that the punishment should fit the crime, but aren't there other punishments, like maybe life in prison, that are just as serious as death? And can we just substitute that in for the death penalty? Well, here Kant is saying, no, there's no substitute or surrogate that can take the place of the death penalty. And why does Kant think this? He says, and this is a more controversial claim, there is no likeness or proportion between life, however painful, and death. Now, what does this mean? This has to mean there's something about life that no matter how bad that life is, no matter how miserable, right? You can imagine putting someone life in prison in solitary confinement. You can imagine the stress and anxiety and pain and utter suffering that would involve. But he says no matter what sort of life we're imagining, it is never as bad as death. In his view, murder is the ultimate crime because it exacts or causes the ultimate evil to a person, which is death. And nothing can match that, no matter how bad we imagine life in prison to be. And so because he believes that, he says the death penalty is the only punishment that matches the severity of murder, and we get the final conclusion of the argument that the only justified punishment for a murder is the death penalty. Now, I'll be very interested to see what you think about this argument because I think each of the premises is certainly controversial and can generate some debate. In terms of P1, you should ask yourself, do you think the retributivist view of punishment is right, or is punishment really about the consequences? In terms of P2, you might ask yourself, do we always necessarily need to match the severity of someone's crime with an equally severe punishment? Is giving someone mercy, or is letting them off the hook, so to speak, is it really as disrespectful as Kant suggests? And finally, is the death penalty really the only punishment that's serious enough to match murder? Is life imprisonment in prison just as bad as death? Is life in prison worse than death? These are all questions I encourage you to consider. But I will cut the video here. Thank you for listening. I will see you next time.